George H.W. Bush was born on June 12, 1924 in Milton, Massachusetts. He was the 41st President of the United States and was President from 1989 to 1993. After graduating from Phillips Academy in Andover, Massachusetts in 1942, Bush joined the U.S. Naval Reserve to fight in World War II from 1939 to 1945. When Bush joined the U.S. Naval Reserve to fight in World War II, he was the nation's youngest commissioned pilot there. He flew 58 combat missions during the war, but on September 2, 1994, he was shot by the Japanese in the vicinity of the Bonin Islands in the Pacific. Although Bush's plane was hit and set on fire, he continued his mission to bomb a radio station. After successfully bombing the station, he parachuted out of his plane and was later rescued from the water from an American submarine. After this mission, he received the Distinguished Flying Cross from his bravery from bombing the radio station. While on leave from the Navy on January 6, 1945, Bush married Barbara Pierce in Rye, New York. After being married, they went on to have 6 children. George, who was born in 1946, Robin, born in 1949 but died in 1953, John, who was born in 1953, Neil was born in 1955, Marvin was born in 1956, and Dorothy was born in 1959. After completing his military service in 1945, Bush went to Yale University where he studied economics and was the captain of the baseball team there. He graduated in 1948 and then moved his family to Texas, where he began as a prosperous career in the oil industry and eventually becoming president of the independent offshore oil drilling company. In the fall of 1974, President General Ford appointed Bush as the head of the U.S. Liaison Office in the People's Republic of China, where he served until he became the director of the CIA in January 1976. Jimmy Carter was elected president. Bush resigned from the CIA in January 1977. After finishing 2 terms as vice president under Ronald Reagan, Bush became the Republican president nominee in 1998. Partner Dan Quayle, a U.S. senator from Indiana, Bush defeated Democratic challenger Governor Michael Dukakis of Massachusetts and his running mate Lloyd Bentsen. Bush had 426 electoral votes and more than 53% of the popular votes to Dukakis' 111 electoral votes and more than 45% of the popular vote. In 1964, Bush won the Republican nomination for the U.S. Senate seat from Texas, but lost in general election. 2 years later, he won a seat in the U.S. House of Representatives, where he served for 2 terms. In 1970, he ran for the U.S. Senate, but was defeated in general election. After this, President Nixon then appointed Bush as the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations, a role which he served in 1971 to 1973, where he became chairman of the Republican Party. Because of the Watergate scandal, on August 7, 1974, Bush asked Nixon to resign from presidency. Nixon officially stepped down 2 days later.
The first thing Bush had to do was work on curbing the deficit spawned in the Reagan years. George had a Democratic-controlled Congress, and he was a Republican, so it made it difficult to do anything. George and his Republicans thought that the best way to fix the deficit would be to cut government spending. The Democrats thought the best way would be to raise taxes. However, George had promised in his presidential campaign that there would be no new taxes. After a struggle with Congress, Bush had to raise taxes, breaking his campaign promises early in his presidential career. These new taxes would reduce the deficit by $500 billion in 5 years. These taxes led to a large decrease in his popularity, however. Due to this budget deal, America entered a short 6-month recession. The unemployment rate along with welfare increased. Due to this, Bush signed a bill that provided benefits for unemployed people. By his second year in office, Bush's economic advisors told him to stop dealing with the economy, so he listened. During his time as president, Bush increased funding for NASA to resume exploration of the moon and to begin the exploration of Mars. He also signed many laws into existence, including the Americans with Disabilities Act, the Radiation Exposure Act, the Immigration Act of 1990, and the Civil Rights Act of 1991.
During his presidency, President Bush devoted much of his time to foreign affairs, an area over which presidents generally don't focus as much as they do with domestic affairs. In his first inaugural address, Bush spoke of unity between the executive and legislative branches in foreign affairs, presenting a united front to the rest of the world. He also put together a team of advisors, including National Security Advisor Brent Scowcroft, and the Secretary of State, Dick Cheney. The team generally worked well together. President Bush approached foreign affairs with his famous conservatism when passing legislation. He did not rush into new actions or policy changes, but gave himself time to consider the administration's policies. When he acted, he did so with conviction and determination. His past experiences gave him a lot of experience in foreign affairs, and he relied on the many contacts within the foreign community. One example of Bush's conservative approach to foreign affairs occurred early in his administration. On June 1989, the Chinese military suppressed a pro-democracy movement demonstrating in Beijing's Tiananmen Square. Using tanks and armored cars, the military crushed the demonstrations and fired into the crowd, killing hundreds of protesters. Although Bush was not a fan of the Chinese government's violent crackdown in Tiananmen Square, he did not want to overreact to the U.S.-Sino relations by overreacting to events. Many in Congress cried out for harsh response to the Chinese government's killing of peaceful protesters. But the Bush administration imposed only limited sanctions. Later in his administration, Bush sent Brent Scowcroft, the Deputy Secretary of State, to China to try to repair the damaged relationship. In the end, U.S.-Sino relations, while always fragile, have generally thrived, particularly due to economic relations, where both nations have benefited from a trading partnership.
George H.W. Bush came into the presidency as a very qualified candidate. He had a long career in both domestic politics and foreign affairs and was vice president for 8. Bush only served for one term and was unsuccessful to convince the American public to give him another 4 years in office. Generally, the Bush presidency is viewed as a successful in foreign affairs, but a disappointment in domestic affairs. In minds of voters, his achievements in foreign policy were not enough. There was still an economic recession, and in 1992, the American public voted for change. Bush came into office promising continuity with the Reagan years and proceeded cautiously. He did not want to radically change domestic policies. He was stopped by a large budget deficit, limited federal revenue to fund programs, and a Democratic-controlled Congress. Critics charged that his administration lacked vision and did not communicate its approach effectively to the public. Although Bush had some notable domestic achievements, such as Americans with Disabilities Act and Clean Air Act amendments, he focused much of his attention on foreign affairs. Presidents generally have more control over foreign policy than domestic policy, and this was marked during his presidency. Bush put together a strong team of advisors, including James Baker, Dick Cheney, and Brent Scowcroft, and together they oversaw significant accomplishments. Bush had a conservative nature and was uncomfortable with bold, dramatic change, preferring stability and calm. These characteristics helped him lead the United States through a period of transition. Although the Bush administration often had little control over unfolding the world events, its responses helped avoid chaos. His refusal to gloat or declare victory during the collapse of the Soviet Empire helped Gorbachev diffuse a backlash from the hardliners of the Soviet government. President Bush showed that he could act unilaterally, but he was also able from a large, diverse coalition. Still, American voters did not think Bush cared enough about domestic issues. Some observers have criticized Bush for not selling his achievements more successfully and running an attempt in 1992. He alienated the more conservative wing of the Republican Party in a variety of ways, including breaking the promise not to raise taxes and cutting military spending. Conservatives felt he betrayed the Reagan Revolution. He also wasn't helped by his unfair image as a rich Ivy Leaguer who was out of touch with the other Americans. Despite living much of his adult life in Texas, he could not overcome the stereotypes associated with his privileged New England background. Only after the battles have cooled and a policy legacy is fully matured can an honest assessment be made of President George H.W. Bush's place in history. The historical assessment of Bush for the presidency is still evolving, and fairly or not, whether a father and a son both serve as presidents of the United States, comparisons are inventable. Since both presidents spent considerable time during their administrations dealing with Iraq, historians will take notice of their respective skills at conducting foreign affairs. For example, Bush's 41st efforts to build an international coalition before embarking on the Persian Gulf War differed greatly from his son's unilateral approach and will likely serve him in the assessments during the future generations of historians. Perhaps the only thing one can say certainly is that their archives of the two Bush presidencies are finally opened, and they provide a fascinating glimpse into the unique father and son relationship in American history.